Welcome, friend. You've had a long day. Let's set it aside for now. Go ahead, dim the lights. Find a comfortable place to sit or lie down. Maybe tuck yourself beneath a blanket or wrap your fingers around a warm cup of tea. Let the outside world soften and fade just for a little while. Tonight, we're going somewhere ancient, but not in the way you might expect. We're not walking in the footsteps of kings or sailing the Nile under banners of gold. Tonight, we walk the alleyways behind the temples and wait outside the doors no one notices. We meet the people whose hands never touched papyrus scrolls, but often scraped something far less pleasant. Because as it turns out, the afterlife wasn't the only thing ancient Egyptians worked toward. Sometimes they worked in, well, literal filth. This is the story of the most disgusting jobs in ancient Egypt. And somehow, they're also some of the most human. When we imagine ancient Egypt, most of us think of gleaming limestone temples, clean white robes fluttering in the desert breeze, graceful priests anointing statues with oils, gold masks, incense, elegance. But who do you think cleaned up after the holy bull? Who disposed of the embalmer's waste? Who got the privilege of unclogging the pharaoh's bathroom drain? The grandeur of Egypt rested, quite literally, on the backs of those doing jobs that made them stink badly. And they did it every day. And in doing so, they left behind stories. Quiet ones, uncelebrated, but worthy nonetheless. So let's dim the spotlight and light a single flickering oil lamp. Now we begin. Beneath the warm sandstone of Thebes, past the singing courtyards and incense-shrouded sanctuaries of a major temple, a very different ritual was quietly taking place. The air, if one could call it that, was dense, not with prayer, but with rot. A humid heaviness clung to the brick-lined corridors as trickles of temple runoff slipped through shallow channels carved meticulously into the foundation. Above, the priests intoned sacred hymns to the gods, sandalwood smoke drifting skyward. But below, crouched in the narrow crawl space beneath the temple's western wing, a man named Pamu carefully dipped his clay lamp into oil and lit the wick. The flame flickered, casting wobbly shadows across the slimy walls. Another day of work had begun. Pamu was what the temple registry called a buck-end chart, a sanitation steward. It sounded official, even noble. But in truth, Pamu was the closest thing ancient Egypt had to a sewer technician. And his route? The sacred drainage shafts of one of the busiest temple complexes in the region. Every morning, just before sunrise, Pamu descended into what he politely called the undersanctum. His job was to inspect and clear blockages in the temple drainage system. These weren't sewers in the modern sense. There were no pipes or flush toilets, but rather a network of open runoff trenches and covered channels designed to carry away washwater, ritual waste, rain, and other unmentionables. And oh, what those channels carried. In the temple above, priests bathed statues in oils. They anointed the altars with honey, milk, and perfumed wine. They washed ritual vessels and sacrificed birds, bulls, and occasionally goats. All of it flowed downward, over altars, through holes in the floor, and into the channels that Pamu patrolled like a monk of muck. There were 3 main shafts beneath the main temple. Each one had a name. The western trench he called the slumbering Nile because of how slowly its water moved. The central shaft was Mother's Grumble, due to the odd echo it produced when clogged. And the eastern route, where he spent most of his time, was simply known as the Beast. The Beast gurgled, It belched. It did not like being poked. Pamu knew to tread lightly there. His tools were simple: a bent wooden scraper, a reed scoop, and a short-handled shovel with copper plating at the edge. Over time, the scraper's tip had worn smooth. The reed scoop warped from wetness. Still, he carried them each day like relics. And tied around his mouth was a strip of linen soaked in vinegar and myrrh to dull the stench. A trick passed down from the last man who held the position, who had quit after only 3 months, with a smile and a nosebleed. Despite the nature of his work, Pamu was no fool. He had once been a trainee scribe, good with hieratic, average with math, but exceptional with metaphor. He wrote in secret, scraps of broken pottery tucked beneath loose bricks in the drainage channel, etched with blunt styluses or smeared ink. One fragment read, "Today, the rat stared at me like a priest at judgment. I bowed in return. He did not blink." Another, "A bird's feather, fallen from sacrifice, floated to me like a message. It said nothing. Still, I nodded." These little poetic inscriptions, mockingly called gutter glyphs by some modern archaeologists, reveal something rare: the voice of a man whose existence would otherwise be lost in a job so lowly most scribes wouldn't bother to name it. And yet, Pamu found beauty in it, in the quiet, in the forgotten spaces where sacred and profane met in a damp, reluctant embrace. He sometimes imagined that the gods, when they cast their gaze downward, saw not just gold and song, but him. There in the dark, tending the waste of holiness, with hands that had once copied verses about stars. One story survived in temple rumor, that of the Night of the Backed Up Nile. It began with an unusually lavish festival. The priests sacrificed more than 20 cattle, 5 dozen birds, and a prized desert hare. The drains groaned under the weight of bones, blood, and remnants. By nightfall, the eastern channel, the beast, refused to flow. The water backed up into the central drain. Incense smoke began to curl oddly. Priests complained of foul breezes disrupting the sacred oils. Pamu was summoned. With his satchel of tools and a slightly exaggerated sigh, he descended into the rising sludge. By the light of a single lamp, he located the blockage: a tangle of bird wings, lotus petals, and several partially digested figs. With the patience of a priest and the expression of someone deeply reconsidering his life choices, he scraped, scooped, and finally dislodged the mess. The resulting surge was biblical. He emerged soaked to the waist, blinking beneath the torchlight. A young acolyte fainted, but the ceremony resumed. And in a margin of a broken ostracon later found decades ago, Pamu had written, "The beast is fed. The temple sings again. I am unpleasantly damp." What strikes us now, from the luxury of our clean, plumbed lives, is how little glamour touched Pamu's job, and how little he seemed to need it. There's something quietly noble about people who do what must be done, especially when no one's watching. Pamu once observed to a fellow steward that the gods know who scrubs their drains. And perhaps they did. After his retirement, Pamu is said to have lived in a modest house near the river, with 2 cats and a garden of bitter herbs. He reportedly died peacefully, his last words being, "Tell the beast I'm not coming back." The temple, it's said, offered no formal tribute. But the drainage flowed smoothly that year. When we think of labor, it's easy to divide the clean from the dirty, the dignified from the base. But in ancient Egypt, those lines blurred often. The man who anointed a god statue, and the man who cleared the runoff from its bath. Both served the same system, one above, one below. And while the world honored one in gold, it forgot the other in shadow. But shadows hold echoes. And Pamu's voice, his humor, his fatigue, his poetry, still whispers beneath the stone. Perhaps the greatest gift we can give him now is to listen, to sit in quiet reflection, and realize that even the lowliest job has its story. And sometimes, the most sacred spaces are the ones that smell absolutely terrible. In the city of Memphis, where stone temples kissed the sunlight and incense mingled with the morning dust, there lived a boy who followed a god. Not metaphorically, literally, step for step, day after day. His name was Jedu. At 12 years old, he had entered into temple service, not with the rank of acolyte or singer, but in the humble position of dung steward. His task was simple in words, but monumental in presence. Follow the Apis bull, the living manifestation of the god Ptah, and clean up after him. The Apis bull was no ordinary creature. Chosen from birth for his jet black coat and sacred markings, he lived in luxury. He was adorned in garlands, led in procession, offered food on silver platters, and saluted with hymns. People came from across the region to glimpse him, to whisper prayers, to press their foreheads against the ground in his presence. But no one stayed long after he relieved himself, except for Jedu. Each morning, the boy was handed a wide, shallow basket woven from palm fronds and a paddle-like scoop carved from sycamore wood. Around his waist, he tied a thick belt of layered linen, both to hold up his tunic and to mask the inevitable smell. The belt, he once remarked, held courage tighter than any sword. He would follow the Apis bull through the courtyards, along the flower-laden paths, even into the outer sanctum. Always at a polite distance, and always alert. Because when the divine digestive process completed its holy work, Jedu had exactly 8 heartbeats to reach the deposit, scoop it gracefully, and bow slightly, never turning his back to the sacred bull as he withdrew with his fragrant offering. It wasn't just about cleanliness. This dung, though foul to most, was sacred. It had to be collected intact, unspoiled, and stored in special clay urns. Some of it was used in fertility rituals, symbolizing the god's abundance. Other portions were buried ceremonially at the edge of fields to bless the soil. A select amount was even mixed with myrrh and burned at solstice festivals, the smoke said to ward off disease and drought. So when Jedu's basket filled with dung, it also filled with purpose. But no amount of divine significance could mask the challenges. The Apis bull was large, impossibly so, nearly as tall as a man's shoulders, with a gaze that seemed to look through you, and a tendency to relieve himself unpredictably, often during processions, sometimes near altars. And then there were the visitors, pilgrims and nobles, priests and merchants, all watching the majestic beast as it moved slowly past them. Jedu became an expert at invisibility. He learned to step in and out of crowds without making noise, to nod just enough to seem respectful, but never enough to draw attention. His goal was clear: be the shadow that cleaned, not the boy who interrupted the sacred mood with a splash and a scoop. Sometimes he succeeded, other times less so. There was the Day of Three Offerings, an unusually hot afternoon during a midsummer festival. The Apis bull, fed a particularly rich mixture of barley and fig paste, began to show signs of digestive distress. Jedu, having worked with the bull long enough to recognize the warning swish of the tail, prepared himself. Still, nothing could have truly prepared him. In the middle of a hymn, Surrounded by high priests and visiting dignitaries from Nubia, the bull let loose a monumental cascade. It splashed across the mosaic floor, struck the hem of a priest's robe, and sent a cluster of temple cats scampering into the crowd. Jadu didn't panic. He bowed, stepped forward, scooped, wiped, sanded, burned a pinch of sweetgrass from his pouch to neutralize the smell. And when he was done, he bowed again, this time to the crowd, and stepped back into the shadows. No one clapped. But later, the high priest pressed a single amulet into his palm and whispered, "The gods need more like you." It was the only time he was ever formally acknowledged. Most days were quieter. Mornings began with the bull's feeding, a ceremony of garlands and murmured blessings. The animal was brushed and polished. Jadu would begin his watch then, eyes always following the tail. When the moment came, he acted quickly and silently. He grew used to the smell. Eventually, he even came to find a strange comfort in it. The routine became sacred, like a rhythm between breaths. Pick up, dispose, Washington pray, repeat. He often visited the burial mound where previous Apis bulls had been laid to rest. Massive sarcophagi of black granite, inscribed with prayers and carved lotus blossoms. Nearby, a smaller mound stood unmarked. Some say it held the discarded offerings of the bulls, ashes, waste, ceremonial remnants. Jadu believed it held more. He would leave flowers there, not for the bulls, but for those like him, the unseen, the uncelebrated. He once whispered, "For the others with baskets." He never told anyone. As he grew older, Jadu trained a boy of his own, Katie, who had sharp eyes and a clumsy walk. He taught him how to judge the direction of wind, how to step without spooking the bull, how to wash his hands with sand and lemon bark, and how to carry the basket without shame. "Never wrinkle your nose," he instructed. "If the gods chose you for this job, they chose your stomach too." Katie once asked him if he regretted not becoming a priest. Jadu chuckled, soft and low. "I stand beside the god every day," he said, "closer than any priest." In time, his knees began to ache. The smell took longer to wash away. His hands, once swift, grew slow. So he stepped aside, handing the basket to Katie, now steady and quiet like he once was. He lived his last years in a modest house near the temple gardens. Every morning, he walked the same path he had followed for decades, but now with a cane. The bull still passed by, older, heavier, and just as divine. On his final day, Jadu sat beneath a date palm and watched the new dung steward step in, bow, scoop, and vanish into the shadows. He smiled. And later, someone found a carved piece of bone beside his bed. Upon it was a short phrase, "The gods walk on clean ground." Someone has to sweep it. When the Apis bull eventually died, as they all did, it was buried with all due ceremony. Priests wept. Nobles came from across the land. And in one corner of the tomb, tucked quietly behind the altar, was a small offering basket. Empty, clean, carefully placed. No one knows who left it, but someone remembered. And that, perhaps, is enough. Outside the bustling quarters of the embalmers in Thebes, just beyond the scent of resin, and just before the edge of silence, sat a long, shallow pit, lined with stone and dried from years of salt and sun. It was not impressive, not adorned, not even marked. But to those who knew, it was one of the most essential and most dreaded stations in the preparation of the dead. This was the linen pit. And the woman who worked there, every single day, without ceremony, was Nebet. She wasn't a priestess. She didn't hold a title. She was known, officially, only as a cloth tender. But the work she did ensured that kings looked royal in death, that scribes were wrapped with dignity, and that even the humblest farmer would journey to the afterlife clothed and whole. Her fingers, calloused and yellowed from natron, never ceased moving. In water, on cloth, through sand, they scrubbed and wrung and soothed. They stitched tears, dabbed away mold, brushed off beetles, and softened knots twisted by the decay of time. You might imagine that she washed new linen, but no. Naboth's task was more intimate than that. She washed used linen, linen that had been buried with the dead, sometimes recently, sometimes not. Egyptians believed strongly in rebirth, in reuse, in cycles. Mummification was expensive, linen even more so. When a burial went unfinished, or when the tombs were robbed, an unfortunately common occurrence, some wrappings were recovered, cleansed, and reused. The outer bands could be salvaged. If washed properly, purified, and rededicated, they were considered ritually clean. And so Naboth, perched beside her pit each morning, faced baskets of grimy, stained, and brittle strips of cloth that had once swaddled arms, torsos, heads. Bits of resin clung to them, sometimes bone dust. A few even carried fragments of skin or hair, though those were carefully burned in separate rituals. She never flinched. To her, each strip of linen told a story. She didn't see horror. She saw memory. With practiced hands, she soaked the cloth in a solution of natron and river water, natron being a naturally occurring salt and baking soda blend found in the nearby deserts. It was drying, preserving, purifying. In fact, it was the very same substance used to dry out the bodies themselves. But for Naboth, natron was her daily companion. It clung to her skin. It gathered in the creases of her lips. Her hair, once soft and black, was bleached and brittle by the age of 30. Still, she worked, one strip at a time. First she soaked, then she kneaded. Then, if needed, she scrubbed with coarse sand to remove stubborn patches of resin or other materials. Finally, she rinsed in fresh water, poured carefully from jars that were filled at dawn, and laid the linen across reed mats to dry under the sun. The sun, she often said, was the final priest. Most people avoided her, not out of cruelty, but from discomfort. Death in Egypt was not something to be feared. It was sacred, expected, even embraced. But the handling of death was a different matter. It was work for the prepared, the consecrated, the strong of stomach and quiet of soul. And Naboth was all of those. Still, she made efforts to keep her spirit clean, even if her hands were never truly so. Every evening, she would bathe in a small basin of lotus water. Not a full bath. Water was too scarce, but a symbolic cleansing. She'd dip her fingers, rub her arms, and brush her hair with a carved bone comb. Her mother, now too frail to walk, would sit beside her and hum the lullabies of their youth. Her cat, named Ib, short for Ibset, or linen heart, often curled on her lap. And when the evening breeze passed through the linen drying racks and ruffled the strips gently like sails of forgotten ships, Naboth sometimes whispered to them. She said they talked back, not in words, not like a story or a warning, but in feelings. Some strips made her hands tingle. Others felt cold, even in the heat. Some resisted cleaning, remaining stiff and foul no matter how many rinses she gave them. Those she burned, not in punishment, but in respect. Not all stories needed retelling. One day, a new worker, a young man with fine cheekbones and a strong jaw, was sent to assist her. He lasted 4 hours. At the sight of a linen strip, marked with brown-black streaks and the faint scent of resin rot, he turned green and fled. Nabet didn't say a word. She simply picked up the cloth and continued, humming to herself. She was not heartless. She understood. It took years to stop smelling the scent of old death in your dreams. Once, she found a strip that had a single line of hieratic scrawled near the hem. She rinsed it carefully, dabbed it dry, and held it to the light. The message read, "To wrap my mouth, that I may speak in the next life." She wept that evening, quietly, with Ib curled in her lap and her mother asleep beside the hearth. Another time, a batch of linen arrived in silence. No paperwork, no ritual box, just 3 baskets delivered at dawn. The strips inside were thick, stiff with pitch, and unusually heavy. Nabet's fingers paused at the first touch. They were soldiers, she guessed, perhaps from a failed campaign in the South. They had not been embalmed, merely wrapped and returned. She cleaned them anyway, carefully, and burned incense when she was done. Her work had rhythm, flow. She became a kind of slow, methodical musician. The slosh of linen in brine, the scrape of sand, the snap of cloth in the breeze. It was a life of repetition, but never monotony. Every strip had meaning, every cleanse, a renewal. And though she would never enter the tombs, she helped prepare. Her work was present in each one, wrapped around noble arms, pressed against kings' brows, layered beneath gold and turquoise. No one ever mentioned her name, but she was there, always. As the years passed, her body began to slow. Her hands stiffened. The natron cracked her fingers beyond healing. So she began training her niece, young Benneret, full of questions and unearned bravery. At first, the girl gagged. Then she grew quiet. Then one day, she took the linen from her aunt's hands and whispered, "I'll do this one." Nabet smiled. When she finally passed, she was not buried in riches, but her niece wrapped her herself in soft, clean linen strips, laundered with lotus and frankincense, sewn at the hem with a tiny note, to the one who listened. And just like that, the woman who cleaned death was wrapped in peace. In the lush wetlands of the Fayum region, where reeds swayed like dancers in the wind, and the Nile's fingers fanned into lakes and swamps, there was a place sacred to a god with crocodile jaws and lion-hearted rage. Sobek, the protector, the fertility bringer, the divine embodiment of Nile strength. And in the middle of Sobek's temple, a dark, green-misted pool shimmered beneath the heavy morning sun. It was there that the crocodiles lived. They were not symbols of the god. They were his incarnations. The priests said so. They anointed the creatures with fragrant oils. They adorned them with collars, sometimes inlaid with faience beads. They whispered prayers over their scaly heads. Visitors came from far across the desert to toss coins and prayers into the water, to kneel beside the pool, eyes closed, ears attuned to the shuffle of the reptilian tail in the weeds. But as with all living things, crocodiles eat. And then, of course, they do what comes after. This is where Chianifer came in. He didn't wear white linen robes like the priests. He didn't carry incense or chant hymns. What he carried was a rake and a long-handled shovel, and sometimes a rope, frayed and worn from dragging things out of dark water. Chianifer was the crocodile pit cleaner. Each day before dawn, he walked barefoot across the temple's cool stone tiles to the edge of the sacred pool. The water, murky and green with algae, seemed to sigh in the early morning hush. The crocodiles were still, motionless statues of muscle and scale lying half submerged near the bank. He nodded to them as one might to colleagues. He respected them. He feared them too. He had to. That fear was what kept him alive. No barrier separated him from the beasts. The temple believed that Sobek's servants should never be imprisoned. They roamed freely in the sacred waters, often slipping into caves carved beneath the temple floor, natural hollows dark and deep. Jennifer never entered those. He stuck to the edge. His job was to clear the pool of excrement, uneaten meat, algae overgrowth, and the occasional remains of unlucky offerings. Some visitors tossed in gifts to please the god: fish, birds, sometimes a goat's leg, sometimes more. Not all of it was eaten, and what rotted needed removing, carefully, with grace, and with exceptional timing. Jennifer learned to watch their tails. The flick meant impatience. A pause in breath meant lurking. Eyes just above the surface? Safe, probably. Eyes below? Run. He used a curved rake to sweep along the bottom. It wasn't deep, just shoulder height. But the water was thick, and the silt clung to everything. Sometimes he pulled up bones. Once, a sandal. Once, a full bird skeleton, perfectly intact, picked clean as a priest's conscience. But the worst was the smell. It clung to him, even after washing, even after scrubbing with charcoal and lemon bark. It wasn't just decay. It was sacred decay. A blend of reptile musk, temple oils, blood, heat, and something older. The stench of divine digestion. Visitors sometimes covered their noses as he passed. One priest commented that he smelled like the breath of the underworld. Jennifer only smiled. "I smell like God's stomach," he said. No one replied. He wasn't bitter, just used to it. And yet, despite the filth and danger, there were quiet beauties to the job. Sometimes, in the early light, the sun caught the water in such a way that the algae shimmered like emerald silk. A crocodile would rise, snout first, slow as dawn, its scales glinting gold beneath the film of the pool. They were ancient, older than the pharaoh's throne, older than some gods, if you listened to the temple whispers. And he worked beside them. That mattered. He often hummed while he worked, low, rhythmic sounds that echoed softly off the stone walls. The crocodiles seemed to like it, or at least didn't mind. Once, one of the younger ones swam close as he sang, rested its head on the edge of the pool just inches from his foot, and blinked. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't move. He finished his song. Then he took 3 steps back and resumed cleaning. Not every day was smooth. There was the time he slipped. A patch of slime near the edge caught his heel, and down he went, into the pool with a splash that echoed like thunder. The crocodiles stirred. 4 of them turned toward him. He didn't scream. He didn't flail. He simply floated, palms up, completely still. The priests later said Sobek himself must have protected him. He said it was the song he'd been humming. The oldest crocodile was called Sekhem. No one named him, but everyone knew. A giant male with jagged teeth and a torn tail. Jennifer believed Sekhem understood speech. He always lingered near the rake, always watched. He spoke to Sekhem sometimes, not aloud, just in thought. "Don't bite me today," he'd whisper in his mind. Sekhem never did. Once, when Sekhem swallowed a bone that got lodged in his throat, it was Jennifer who noticed the gurgle. He alerted the priests. A healing ritual was performed. Jennifer stood nearby, rake in hand, quiet and still. Afterward, he was offered wine. He declined. He preferred to drink only after sunset. Some said it kept the crocs from smelling it on his breath. Jennifer's fingers were rough with scars. 2 of them bent oddly, broken in a scuffle with a younger croc who mistook his rake for a fish. And he was missing 3 toes from his left foot. A priest once asked why he hadn't retired after that. He replied simply, "The water is part of me now." He wasn't married, no children, but he had a sister who visited monthly, bringing figs and honey cakes. She always made him wash before he hugged her. He never minded. And every so often, when the moon was low and the pool silent, he would kneel by the water's edge and whisper prayers, not to Sobek, but to the crocodiles. He thanked them for their mercy. On the day he died, no one knew until the rake was found, leaning carefully against the wall, the pool freshly skimmed, the walkway swept. There were no signs of struggle. His sandals were neatly placed by the door. The oldest crocodile, Sekum, was seen circling the edge slowly, not hunting, not basking, just watching. And later that week, when the temple held a small ceremony, a scribe noted a strange thing. The water, for once, had no smell. They said the god accepted the offering of service. And the pool was quiet. For a while, in the shaded inner courtyard of a noble's estate, somewhere along the tree-lined avenues of Middle Egypt, birds chirped sweetly, a breeze stirred the papyrus fans, and everything looked perfect. Almost. The white limestone floors were swept thrice daily. Lotus blossoms floated in shallow pools. Children darted between pillars giggling, their gold earrings flashing in the sunlight. But if you looked closely, just beneath the hem of a silk tunic, or near the nape of a tiny neck, beneath a neatly braided lock of hair, you might notice a scratch, a fidget, a tiny scowl. And if you looked even closer, you might see movement. Very small, but unmistakable. And that's when they called for Hennet. Hennet was not a healer, not a priestess, not a nurse. She held no titles, no amulets of rank. But everyone in the household knew her, especially the children. Hennet was the Keset Netere, a divine groomer, though her true title might have been something simpler, the royal lice picker. Every morning, Hennet arrived just after the house was washed in incense smoke, just before the morning meal. She moved with the silent confidence of someone who knew her place, not in the hierarchy of titles, but in the delicate balance of daily peace. Because if she didn't come, the scratching would start. And once the scratching started, the complaints would follow. And once the complaints began, the gods themselves might as well take the day off. Hennet's tools were humble. A narrow-toothed comb carved from polished ivory, a small wooden bowl of cedar oil, a strip of linen to tie back unruly curls, and, most importantly, her fingers, gentle and precise. She worked with the children first. They trusted her. They knew her lap was safe, her fingers cool and soft, her voice a gentle hum that often wandered into stories as she worked. Sometimes she told them of the stars. How long ago the sun became so annoyed by a swarm of lice on his shoulders that he flung them into the sky, and they turned to stars out of shame. Other times, she spoke of a wise beetle who taught the pharaohs how to scratch with dignity. The children giggled. They always did. But they sat still. Mostly. She would seat them on a low stool, place her linen cloth around their shoulders, and begin. One lock at a time. Slow. Careful. Parting the hair, inspecting the scalp, flicking any unwelcome guest into the small dish beside her, where a bit of ash and vinegar awaited. She was quick with the pinch, soft with the pull. Her thumb was calloused just enough to be efficient. The oil on her fingers helped loosen knits. The children rarely cried, If they did, it wasn't because of her touch. It was because they didn't want to leave her stories. Once, one of the noble sons, barely 7 years old and full of mischief, asked her, "Why don't the gods pick our lice?" Hennet smiled and replied, "Because they sent me to do it better." The child believed her. Maybe, on some level, so did she. The adults came next. More pride there. More silence. A little more embarrassment. She never judged. She was called into bedchambers quietly, behind screen walls, into dressing rooms where the wives of priests or minor officials removed their golden wigs and looked to her with a kind of unspoken plea. Don't mention it. Just fix it. Hennet did. She made no sounds, offered no reaction. She only nodded and began the sacred ritual again. Part, search, pluck, press, and cleanse. Some of the noble women had elaborate hairstyles, braids intertwined with turquoise beads, locks perfumed with oils from far-off lands. Lice didn't care about social class or perfume. They were equal opportunity invaders, and Hennet knew every hiding spot. She had been trained by her aunt, who used to work in the palace nursery. From her, Hennet learned the secrets of scalp textures, the places lice preferred during dry seasons, the effect of moon cycles on hatching times. It was science in its way, sacred knowledge, passed woman to woman, finger to finger. And just like that, she became indispensable. The estate steward never listed her name in the official roster, but her arrival was noted by the staff. Her absence, a crisis. On her day off, one rare festival a month, there was chaos. The children fought. The nursemaid tried to fill in, unsuccessfully. The mistress of the house scratched behind her ear during a dinner with a merchant from the Delta and nearly threw a goblet in frustration. The next morning, Hennet returned to whispers of relief. She pretended not to notice. She only unrolled her linen wrap, cleaned her comb, and began again. Despite the intimacy of her work, Hennet remained modest. She lived in a small house with her younger brother, a scribe in training. Every evening, she would wash her hands with lemon peel and clay, soak her combs in vinegar, and light a small bundle of herbs near her bedding to chase away the scent of cedar oil and hair. She kept her own hair short, easier to manage, easier to inspect. She never wore jewelry, nothing to catch on strands or snag on braids. Her beauty was simple, clean, a quiet beauty, like the inside of a temple just after the candles are snuffed. One afternoon, a visiting noblewoman from the capital noticed Hennet's care and asked to bring her back to her own estate for a season. The lady of the house refused. Hennet never heard the conversation, but she noticed the next day that her workbench had been polished, a fresh cushion laid on her stool. She smiled. Once, tragedy struck. A small girl, barely 4, developed a fever from infected bites. Something Hennet had warned the nursemaid about days earlier. She sat by the girl's side through the night, not as a healer, but as comfort. She combed her hair slowly, gently, whispering lullabies in a voice so soft it seemed part of the wind. The girl survived, and Hennet never mentioned the nursemaid again. She had her place in the world, not glamorous, not sung in temple hymns, but known, needed, trusted. As she aged, her eyesight dimmed slightly, but her fingers did not. She trained her niece, a bright-eyed girl named Satsabek, who liked to joke that she'd rather clean crocodile pits. Hennet only laughed. Then you'll never understand how much peace there is in a clean scalp. When she passed, quietly, in her sleep, the household mourned. Not in ceremony, but in silence. The children asked if the stars would come down to get her. One boy suggested that maybe the gods needed her now, to comb the heads of angels. No one argued. And somewhere, tucked into the corner of the courtyard where she once worked, her stool still sat. Beside it, a single ivory comb, gleaming in the sun, untouched, still sacred, in the heart of Luxor, where temple columns rose like petrified forests, and the Nile carved its endless path through the dust of centuries. Life pulsed, loud, layered, and earthy. Markets bustled with traders selling papyrus scrolls, honey cakes, and hot bowls of lentils. Priests in spotless robes drifted past commoners arguing over fish prices. Children played with clay animals near the street gutters. Sacred processions chanted their way past taverns and homes. It was a city alive, beating with human noise. And with all that human activity came something else. Waste. Lots of it. Behind the curtain of grandeur, down alleys too narrow for chariots, behind homes and shops and even temples, were the latrines. Not like the grand marble baths of Rome that would come later. No, these were simpler, earthier, holes dug into shared pits, rows of stone seats in some places, flat platforms in others. And in this sprawling city of light and shadow, one man kept them clean. Khonsu. He was not a priest. He was not a builder, or a craftsman, or a soldier. He was what some scornfully referred to as the sweeper of the sacred pits. A title no one wanted, but everyone needed. Every morning, before the sun had fully crested the desert horizon, Khonsu would rise from his modest home near the western edge of the city. He tied a faded cloth over his nose, packed his bundle of tools, reed brushes, a wide scraper made from smooth stone, a leather bucket, a bit of sweetgrass for his pocket, and set off. His first stop was always the latrine behind the open-air market. This was the worst one. The pit filled quickly, some days too quickly. The scent struck first, thick and oppressive, a wall of air that clung to the skin and settled into the folds of your tunic. But Khonsu didn't flinch. He dealt with worse. He moved quietly, not out of shame, but out of respect, for himself and for the people too embarrassed to meet his eyes. He understood. No one wanted to think about where it all went. No one wanted to picture the man who scraped the trench behind the bakery, or who poured hot sand over the latrine behind the temple's guest house. But Khonsu knew that his was a necessary grace. His work kept disease at bay. His hand stilled the rise of rot. Without him, the smell would creep into the temple corridors, into the dining courts, into the dreams of merchants and scribes. So he swept. He scraped. He poured ash and sand to cover the worst of it. On bad days, he called his donkey, an old patient creature named Dedi, to haul the bucket cart to the refuse trench outside the city walls. On worse days, he did it himself, but he never complained. He once told a friend, if the gods made mouths, they made the other end too. That friend laughed, then gagged from the smell. Khonsu just kept sweeping. He had rules. Always start before the heat of the day. Always work from top of the trench down. Never touch your face. Never greet a priest until you've washed. He carried a pouch of dried mint leaves, which he crushed between his fingers when the stench rose too strong. He chewed sweetgrass as he worked, not for taste, but for defiance. A little green life in the midst of human waste. Children watched him from a distance. Some laughed. Some mimicked his gait. Some threw stones. He ignored them. But once, a boy no older than 10 stepped too close to a trench and slipped, his foot catching the edge of the latrine seat, his body lurching forward. Khonsu dropped his tools. He caught the child by the arm, hauling him back with surprising strength. The boy cried. Not from pain, but from embarrassment. His tunic was splattered, his dignity bruised. Khonsu didn't scold him. He removed his own outer tunic, wrapped the boy in it, and walked him home. He said nothing to the boy's mother. The next day, there was a fresh loaf of bread on Khonsu's doorstep. No note, no words, just warm thanks. Some days, he sang. Old folk songs, soft and off-key, to keep his spirits from sinking too deep. The songs echoed oddly through the trench walls, bouncing off stone and clay in haunting harmony. He once claimed that the latrines had their own music. The city exhales here, he said. There was humor in him, dry as desert dust. One day, a temple scribe passed by and sneered, "King of the flies!" Khonsu bowed, slow and theatrical. "Even kings must sit somewhere," he replied. The scribe blushed. From then on, they nodded to each other in passing. He had a wife once, Meret. She was a potter. Strong hands, kind eyes. She knew what he did. She accepted it, loved him through it. When she died of fever one winter, Khonsu worked through the mourning period, not because he didn't care,